And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Great today to have on Justin Giboney from the AND campaign. Justin, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Well, Justin, been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. Been following your work, the book Compassion and Conviction, the work of the AND campaign. Just appreciate what you're attempting to accomplish, what you are accomplishing in public life. So, for those that may not be aware of your work, would you jump in? Give us a little bit about your background, your current position, how God called you into ministry in the public square.
Yeah, well, generally, my ministry is focused on the intersection between faith and politics. I am a ordained minister. I'm a attorney. I'm also a political strategist and a husband and a father of three boys. And just to kind of get into how I got into kind of this space was, I've been doing political strategy and running campaigns for over a decade. Mostly, local elections, things of that nature. And as I was doing it, the deeper I got into it, by chance, my faith was getting stronger at that time as well. And I started to just look and see what was really a false dichotomy in our political landscape, where basically if people cared about social justice, they felt like they had to go all the way to the left, right? If you care about criminal justice, if you care about poverty and all that stuff, you go all the way to the left. If you're more focused on moral order and the sanctity of life and religious liberty, then you go to the right, all the way to the right. And with both of those, you were losing something. And I just thought that was a false choice. I felt that Christians shouldn't really have to make that decision. In 2012, I end up going to the Democratic National Convention. And at that convention, one of the things that would happen that I think kind of started the AND campaign was there was a voice vote to remove God-given from the platform. And it was very clear that the people who wanted it out were a lot louder or just more, more excited than the people who wanted it in. And so I left that moment saying that I've got to distinguish myself in this space. I can't let people walk away thinking that I, as a Christian, agree with everything that my party agrees with. I cannot be camouflaged in this space. And I had friends that were in the Republican Party who were feeling the same way, during the Tea Party era, and feeling like, some of the policy just didn't have the compassion that it should have had. And that's really where, the idea for the AND campaign came. The AND campaign literally means compassion and conviction, justice and moral order, love and truth. That's what the gospel is about. And what the AND campaign has tried to do is re-articulate that into the public square based on what's going on today, to say, hey, you need to kind of make sure that your political affiliation isn't religious in nature and start approaching this in a different way. And that's kind of how I came about it. Been in politics, but really had to find a way to make my faith a serious part of my engagement.
Well, this is exactly why I was looking forward to this conversation. My background being a little bit more in the Republican Party, growing up kind of more conservative side of things, and seeing at times biblical principles being voiced but not being followed. And talked to a lot of pastors that sense that they're called to engage in politics, and then there's kind of a bait and switch where, well, actually, we just wanted your influence and your authority. But we actually aren't going to follow those principles in public life. And so many pastors tell me, I just feel burned by the process. I think are sensing something very, very similar. One of the things the AND campaign does is kind of civic education. And certainly for many Christians that are trying to kind of hack their way through engaging politics, the first question is, well, should I be engaged at all? Or is this something I should just kind of throw my hands up and say, everybody else should be engaged in that? But this is not something that a Christian should be getting their hands dirty in. In your recent book, Compassion and Conviction, which was written with Michael Ware, I believe Chris Butler as well, that's one of the key issues that you jump into. So for you, as you're talking to churches and Christians, what's your argument? What do you tell them about being involved in politics?
Yeah, I say that you should be involved. What we have to understand is that politics touches every aspect of life. We just saw over the last year or so that based on politics, it can decide whether we go to church or not, right? Where we're able to go to church. It decides what our kids are learning. It has something to do with what's in our food, all these things. And so for us to put our hands up and say we don't want anything to do with it, I think is just not being good stewards. So we should be involved, but often what we have to do is reframe how we think of politics, right? I think we should think of politics as a tool. I think that it's a robust opportunity and a tool to love our neighbors, right? To make sure that we're looking, that we're protecting human dignity and that we're promoting human flourishing. Because the interesting thing is, even some folks who say they don't want to engage at all, you got to realize that you are engaged. You live in a democracy, you're a citizen. And so whether you choose to vote or choose to do these other things or not, even you not speaking or you not voting is a statement within itself. Yeah. So there's really no avoiding politics, especially in this type of government. And what Christians can do is use their influence to help other people, not to put their identity in the parties or anything like that, but to say, hey, I care that those kids across the tracks aren't receiving a good education or, don't have any tutoring or whatever it is. And I want to provide resources and I want to make sure that they're treated fairly. And so I care who the sheriff is. I care who the district attorney is. We can't just care about those things when they impact our families. As Christians, if we love our neighbor as ourselves, we have to care about them always.
That's helpful. And one way that I've been framing it recently is when Jesus said, render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, I'd say, well, who is Caesar in the American context? And I'd argue it's not the president, Congress, it's we the people. Sure. And so if we have authority, we therefore have responsibility in this system. So I really appreciate framing it as an expression of love for neighbor, that if you truly care for them, that you're going to engage. The next issue that you jumped into in the book is, well, church and state. That's not controversial at all, the relationship between those two institutions. So biblically, how should Christians view the intersection of church and state?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we have to understand that government is a God-ordained institution. And so the general understanding for us is that we should want government. We should want order. We have a God of order. And what government does, it creates order and it's supposed to bring about justice, right? So we don't have to go into a situation where I'm worried, that Josh is going to come by and do something to me and not have any consequences. We don't want to live in the type of uncertainty that prevents us from actually flourishing. Governments are there to help us flourish. What we also know is that we're broken people. And so whatever we put together is not going to be perfect. And there's going to be a brokenness to it. And we should strive to fix it. So I think that's the first part. Like, we should try to obey government. We should understand that government is important and can be helpful for us. But we also have to understand, and this is where so you have the, Romans 13, right? And then you also have the prophets who come and say, hey, when there's not justice, when there is iniquity coming from our governing authorities and coming from society, we can't go along with it. Right. So you have this tension that Christians live in. Yes, generally, we should have a posture of obedience to government and doing what we're asked to do. We don't just break the laws because that's our preference to break the laws. Mm-hmm. However, when there's injustice, when there's iniquity, when the poor are being mistreated, we also have this obligation to protect human dignity, to make sure people are treated properly. I mean, if you read the prophets, this is a covenant breach. When Amos comes to Israel and others and says, hey, he's not just talking about idolatry and sexual immorality. He's saying, look at how you're treating people in your courts. Look at the partiality in your courts. Look at how you're treating poor people. God is threatening to destroy you because of these things. And so I think Christians also need to recognize that we need to push back when the government isn't doing things right and they're violating human dignity. And that's something we always have to be vigilant to understand. The other thing that I would add is that the separation between church and state is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts that there is. Some people would take that to mean that government and religion shouldn't have any kind of intersection at all. And that's just not possible, right? Mm-hmm. The government and the church are always going to have some contact, and that's not always bad, but there should be a level of separation, right? We don't want the state to tell us how to worship, right? Mm-hmm. And we also don't want them to prevent us from worshiping. So that's really how it play out. But what I'll tell you is the separation of church and state certainly does not mean that you shouldn't bring your values into the public square. Now, we live in a pluralistic society, so you have to respect other people's views, but it was never anybody's intention to say that a Christian shouldn't consider their biblical values when they vote or who they vote for. That's not what that means. And the people who present that are either very ignorant or they're trying to mislead us.
That's really helpful. We just had Jonathan Lehman on, and I love the way he kind of frames it of certainly there should be a separation between church and state, but not between religion and politics, and that there should be that influence. And so just encouraging Christians, absolutely, you should take your values with you when you engage in this space. Of course, compassion and conviction, the title of your book, and one of the aspirations, kind of the key aspiration of the AND campaign. One of the big things you talk about is rhetoric and civility. And even that the concept of being compassionate while also being principled and having conviction is a change, or there's a difference there from the way a lot of Christians engage politics. So how should our kind of rhetoric, the way that we engage politics, be different than non-Christians?
Well, I think we have to understand why we're engaging. And it goes back to that conversation of loving our neighbors. We cannot come into politics and be all about the politics of Christian self-interest. And I think sometimes when you talk about the moral majority and others, it was really about protecting us first and then maybe getting to everybody later. Sometimes, many times, not getting to them at all. And so I do think it's important to say, no, I'm here as a representative of the kingdom. And I'm trying to make sure that the will of God is inserted into these conversations where I can within this, kind of constitutional framework. And so as Christians, we always need to have a level of separation from our party, from government, at least so we can critique it. And I think one of the problems that we run into, as I said earlier, is our political affiliation becomes religious in nature. And what people start doing is once we choose a side, we start defending that side at all costs. If you talk about somebody's party or you talk about one of their favorite politicians, they're going to come at you like you talked about their mama, right? And why is that?
Yeah,
it's because their identity is tied up in it. Instead of being able to say that, hey, this is a tool that I use to get something done for the kingdom, I'm now saying I'm all in. I can't even critique my side because that would mean that I'm giving something or conceding something to the other side. And so for Christians, I think there always has to be the ability to step back and say, I'm really not on either side, right? Like I may think, and this is not to create a false equivalence, but I may think that one side is somewhat better, but I still must critique them lest I fall into their fallibility, right? Because none of these ideologies or parties that we follow are inerrant or infallible. And so we need to be able to point that out if we're not going to kind of be promoting some of these iniquities.
I was talking to a friend this morning and was just burdened because he's working to disciple a fellow Christian. However, that Christian has literally chosen a church based on political preference rather than on a strong commitment to the Word of God. And I just wonder how many of us have kind of had our politics form our religion rather than the other way around, which is exactly backwards, as you're saying. And so that's something I think for all of us to watch out for, especially and I hope things change, but it does seem like we're going to be in an increasingly polarized climate in the United States. So certainly something to watch out for. So in chapter 4 of your book, and this I think is a really helpful thought, you talk about doing a political inventory. And so reviewing the different issues, here's the quote, you should do an inventory of where you stand on issues like immigration, criminal justice, abortion, and sexual ethics, and then be honest about how you came to those conclusions. Did you reach your opinion to the love and truth of the Bible, or have you been indoctrinated by a group identity outside of Christ? So would you walk us through what an inventory like that would look like? And especially, how do you find a space, even personally, how do you find that space to do an honest inventory rather than being, looking at the way your parents engage, the way the people in your church engage? And so being able to honestly inventory your political beliefs without just kind of coming right back around to what you've always believed.
Really, it's a part of a kind of larger self-examination, right? We should always be examining ourselves based on biblical scrutiny to see that we're being faithful. And especially when it comes to in politics, it's important because a lot of the positions we take, we assume they're rooted in the Bible or just rooted in our values, but don't understand that sometimes we've been manipulated or pushed in a certain direction and we didn't even notice it, right? Whether it's the talking points that we've been, that have been thrown at us, all this communication that comes at us, it has an impact on us, whether we know it consciously or not. And so what I was saying is that sometimes, and I had to do this myself, we have to sit down and say, okay, here are some very serious kind of moral issues, whether it be poverty, immigration, abortion, or whatever. Where do I stand on this? And when you write down where you stand. And one thing I had to realize on something like abortion is I had gone to the left, but outside of talking points, outside of what was really kind of propaganda, I couldn't really explain how I ended up there. And so I had to really sit down and say, no, you're not in the right place. You're not in a faithful position on this. And the conclusions that you came to were based on propaganda, talking points. They were not based on biblical precepts. And I think we all need to have that honest conversation with ourselves because we're all vulnerable to it. We all get so much information thrown at us. We're all in different circles and different peer groups that have, folks, we're all subject to folks who may have hidden agendas or whatever. And if we don't do that, then what happens is we're basically outsourcing our opinions to others and being controlled by sources that aren't concerned with what's biblical at all. And so I think whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, all Christians need to do that level of self-examination, not just on politics, but on life in general, to see where you're at and see how you're operating.
And I'm sure to this, most American Christians would say amen. And they would kind of point across the aisle like, hey, you guys need to examine yourself. So let's dig into the details just a little bit there. I enjoy the tweet that you have pinned on your account. And you kind of speak to both sides. So if you wouldn't mind digging into this just a little bit. And you say, make conservatism sympathize and pursue racial justice. And then make progressivism acknowledge absolute truth and the sanctity of life. And so the word of God is quick and powerful. It cuts, right? And so what is the word of God how is the word of God speaking to Christians in those two camps?
You need to know the flaws on your side of the aisle, the flaws in your ideological tribe. Because if you're not aware of those things, then you're susceptible to them. Right. And so one of the problems that we have is people defend their party and they defend their ideological tribe so vehemently because they don't know that it's pretty dirty, too. And it gets a lot of things wrong. And it has some things that are not even close to being biblical. But unless you do that work, you wouldn't know. So, for instance, let's talk about progressivism. I think one of the problems with progressivism is, number one, you have this postmodernism that's a part of it, where a lot of people think there is no absolute truth. And you cannot be a Christian and be faithful and not believe in absolute truth, right? In fact, I don't think you can believe in justice and not believe in absolute truth. How can you, when you're demanding that somebody do justice, you're saying that they need to treat some other people by a certain standard. Now, the person you're talking to may have a tendency to do that or may not. They may believe it or not believe it. But if you expect them to abide by it, that means that there's an absolute truth about other people's human dignity. And if everybody has human dignity, to even make that statement, there has to be an absolute truth, right? Yeah. And so I think when it comes to progressivism, that's one of the issues that you find, the not wanting to deal with truth, but because truth doesn't always fit what I want to do as the individual. Truth doesn't always fit my expression. And Christians who are a little more progressive, that's all right. But if you don't realize how progressivism will push you into self-definition and self-indulgence, then you're going to be in trouble. And so you need to make progressivism look at the sanctity of life and the importance of that. Don't lose that because you're trying to follow an ideology. If we go over to conservatism, I think there is sometimes that lack of compassion, seeing the rules and setting the rules and saying what's right, but not understanding and having grace for people that are in very tough positions that you may not completely understand. Now, that doesn't change the doctrine on a certain issue necessarily, but if you don't have love, then you really don't have truth either. And it turns us into hypocrites. So one thing that I would say is when it comes to racial justice, if you're a conservative, make sure that you're really wrestling with that and not just taking the talking points that you get from your side or from the kind of confirmation bias that you hear on talk radio or whatever, and just dismissing things that have serious substance. One of the things that you see from both sides of the ideological spectrum is that they take complex issues and they reduce them. They make them as simple as possible to keep a clean narrative. So when you talk to somebody on the left about abortion, they say, oh, it's simple. A woman's right to choose. That's it. There's nothing else to say. That's simple. How could you not believe in that? And you say, well, actually, if you include this other human being that's a part of this, it actually is a little bit different than what you're saying. But they remove that from the conversation. If you talk to somebody, on the conservative side about racial justice, a lot of times what you're going to hear is this romanticized version of American history. If American history is as great as some of these folks say, then we don't have a race problem. But if you actually deal with the real history of America, with some of the things we've excelled in and some things we've really done poorly, then you have to deal with the fact that it was only 60 or so years ago where we had very serious racism in our laws. And if we really believe that that just fades away, even though it was in our laws for hundreds of years, I think we're fooling ourselves. So that's the kind of dealing with truth and dealing with your convictions and dealing with the compassion of the gospel that we all have to do regardless of what side we're on. And if we're not willing to go through that process, then we're going to be fooled into not being in a biblical space. And too often it happens.
What I appreciate about what you're saying is that taking a kind of gospel-centered approach, which is a term that you use and we use it all the time. Of course, there's a question of what do you mean by that? But it's this kind of nonpartisan approach where we're trying to promote biblical principles first, but realize that we live in a participatory democracy with a primarily two-party system. That's where we are, right? And it's messy. But this is not a moral equivalency of different issues. We're not saying that there aren't good points raised by those that say the life issue, and there are Christians that would say the life issue is the most important, most pressing moral issue in public life. That's where my position would be. But then talking to other Christians who have a history, a family history that they've been through Jim Crow or slavery, and you can just learning their perspective. That's why this is something they really focus on. And so it's basically a Romans 14 approach, be fully persuaded in your own mind, follow scripture, but then try to work together with others in a sense of encouraging the body of Christ and moving it forward.
I would say this, because we're definitely not trying to, and that's what people get at. Like anytime you critique both sides, they're saying, oh, that's boathism, it's a false equivalent. No, it doesn't have to be equivalent, right? Like the infection in my left leg, if it's worse than the infection in my right, I still have to do something about the infection in my right leg because they'll both kill me. Right. So, when people automatically jump to, oh, this boathism and all this other stuff. No, you have to, in the Bible, God doesn't just say, you know what, I don't like, Jesus doesn't just say, I have a problem with the Pharisees. Let me just join the Sadducees. No, he's able to examine both and see the issues on both sides.
That's great. And I don't know, hopefully it's okay if I use that. That's awesome. Yeah, about the infections in the two legs. That's really, really helpful. So that brings us to one of the toughest questions that I've been wrestling with. And again, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you. It grieves my heart when I see the polling come out every election season. And I know that some Christians find these terms offensive, but I'm just using the polling categories. And that is that white evangelicals would vote about 90% or maybe 70, 80%, primarily Republican. And then that black Protestants would vote something like 95% for the Democratic Party. Orthodox biblical believers love Jesus, but have almost completely separate political, if not views, at least practices. And so one of the things on this podcast, one of the kind of continuing themes that I'm just wrestling with is I know some of the history, and I would like you to touch a little bit on that. But then why is this an opportunity for the church? And how can the church engage this issue moving forward? I don't think we're going to just wave a wand and 400 years of history is going to go away. Mm-hmm. Those political affiliations are going to drop off. So what is the best thing that we can be doing, trusting that God's going to work in hearts, that the ultimate answer is the gospel, but what's the best way for Christian citizens to engage this issue?
Right. So, I mean, from a historical point of view, basically, African Americans have generally been on the opposite side of who at one time were Dixiecrats, right? Which were the conservatives in the South. When the conservatives in the South were Democrats, a lot of Black people were Republicans, right? Because of Lincoln and so on. When the Dixiecrats and some other things happened and they went to the Republican Party, Black people went over, and were Democrats. So you hear this stuff about, well, the Republicans freed the slave. That's a little bit misleading. It's really been about the folks who were at serious odds with civil rights, the civil rights movement and all that. We've mostly been on opposite sides as African Americans from those people. That's kind of how it breaks down. And the church has to deal with the fact that a large part of the American church completely rejected the civil rights movement. You got to deal with it. Like, you can't just ignore it, say, oh yeah, that was bad, and then just keep moving. No, what was it that made you miss that? And have you made the corrections to make sure that it'll never happen again? Now, in my opinion, the problem to me isn't, I really don't care that somebody's in another party. Again, because I don't take my party to heart. It's not part of my identity. So I don't say, hey, Josh, you're a Republican. Man, I'm looking at you a little bit different right now. I may look at, what policy you support. I'm going to look at who you voted for, but us two being in different parties doesn't matter, because again, if you see party as a tool and not part of your identity, you expect much less from it, right? And you're trying to use it to get done what you need to get done. Where I see the opportunity is, and I don't think this is just by just random, is you have a critical mass of Christians in both parties, which means if we disconnect ourselves as far as identity from these parties and ideological tribes and focus on Christian principles together, we actually can have a lot of influence. Guess what? In our framework from the AND campaign, we don't have to agree on everything. So we may never be in the same party. That's okay with me. But there should be issues where we say we're going to work together on these issues: criminal justice, voter rights, religious liberty, abortion. On these issues, we can disagree on everything else. We're going to support candidates and we're going to work together on these issues. We could have so much influence if we were able to do that, if Christians were being savvy enough to understand what politics is really about and not be so, so caught up in who's in what party. Let's whatever party you're in, let's use it for kingdom work, and it won't be as big of a deal. But what happens is, unfortunately, and why it does divide us, is we've allowed ourselves to follow these parties and follow their mentalities and follow their prescriptions in ways that pulls us apart.
That's so good. The idea that we would use party as a tool rather than finding it as part of our identity. Wow, if we could just repeat that a couple hundred times, even in my own heart.
And the way that you know that you're doing that, Josh, is if I can critique or even insult your party and you don't feel like that's an insult to you. Right now, Josh, if you said something about the Democratic Party, whether I thought you were right or wrong, whether it was harsh or not harsh, I wouldn't feel like you attacked me, because I don't care about it to the extent where what you say, I might correct you, but I'm not going to be offended because it's not part of who I am.
No, that's so good. So good. In the book, you talk about protest and advocacy. This goes back a little bit to that first question about whether Christians should be involved in politics. But I love the chapter that kind of sets out the biblical examples of advocating in the public square and even protesting things. So would you just share a couple of those examples, mainly from the Old Testament, that you shared in the book?
Yeah, I mean, you have so many instances. I mean, you can go to Amos, you can go a lot of different places and just see people saying, which is the protest, this is wrong. This needs to change. So Amos goes, to Amaziah the priest and the others, and he says, look at what you're doing in the courts. Look at how you're treating the poor. You are wrong, and God cares. God cares about these things. Christians, protest is not something negative, right? Some protest is really shaking up something or disrupting something that needs to be disrupted, especially people who are Protestants. And in this space, you shouldn't have a problem with people protesting when they see something is wrong. I think one of the issues, we conflate this with theology, but I think it's ideology. I think some people, because they're comfortable with the status quo, then protest becomes a bad thing. Not because it's somehow biblical, but because it's shaking up with what I'm comfortable with and what my ideology says is best. But that's not necessarily biblical. So there are times, I think there are immoral protests. I think there are times when protests are bad, but you really have to look at the substance of what's being protested, right? When it comes to advocacy, what are you trying to, what are you, what solutions are you bringing to the table to say, this is what I think is best? This is how we should go about certain things. And throughout the Bible, you see people, and throughout history, you see Christians doing this. When you talk about abolition, when you talk about all these different issues, Jim Crow, the civil rights movement, it's Christians coming and saying, look, something's not right. This is how we need to change our society. This is an amendment we need to make. This is a change we need to make to bring about better policy or a better way of life. Because again, in my opinion, I think Christians should primarily be about protecting human dignity and promoting human flourishing in the public square. And I think protest and advocacy get us closer to that if we do it the right way.
I love that chapter because it cuts against something I hear so often in the church. And I get the motivation and just kind of the daily schedule and work of a local pastor. He's trying to disciple people. He's worried about, it's the budget. We're going to make budget. He's got a deacon mad at him. He's got to run to a funeral or a wedding. And then now you're like, hey, you need to go protest this, the societal injustice that's going on, or you need to join in the fight for biblical principles or something. And it's just like, I just don't know if I can carry another bowling ball. But that chapter said this is an important part of Christian ministry. It's an important part of Christian citizenship. So
it is. And I think the other thing that goes with that, Josh, is that you can't expect the pastor to do everything. And so when we talk about protesting and doing these other things, we're talking about doing it as a body, because Josh may not be able to make it to every, moment to advocate, but civic engagement isn't really an individual endeavor. Josh can support the institution, right? We should do these things to institutions. And so when Josh can't make it, if he's supporting in some way that institution that does those things, then Josh is contributing to it, even if he's not there. So that's another, because people can get really, I think, overwhelmed and be like, man, I can't do everything. And you're right. You're not gonna be able to read every policy. You're not gonna be able to be at every event, but you can support, and you should be there if you can. Now, let me be clear about that, but you should support the institutions that are doing that, because we're supposed to work as a body anyway. And for Christians, that should be, that should be very clear.
You published, I think yesterday, a very helpful article, Christianity Today, entitled "For Cosmopolitan Christians, Secular Approval is a Common Temptation." And just reading through that, you tell the story about a Christian school that you were speaking at. And I'd like to have you share that story, but then also kind of the broader issue of, as some Christians are seeing what's going on, maybe they realize, hey, some of American history that we've just kind of glanced over. And so they realize, well, we should be talking about it. But then instead of filtering it through a biblical lens, it's just, well, let me grab whatever response is on the shelf that's kind of prepackaged. It's perhaps a more secular, progressive type of vision. And you, in this article, I thought very helpful, warned against that type of approach. So would you mind, sharing a little bit about the story that you shared in the article, and then a little bit about this issue?
Sure. Let me preface it with this. I mean, I think one of the problems that we have is, as I said before, large parts of the American church have not demonstrated what justice and compassion look like in the social context. And so we have a lot of young people who see the importance of justice, who even read it in the Bible, but don't get an example from the church of how that should happen. And so they're looking to outside resources, and they're looking to secular society for those answers. The story I give in the article is about me going to a local Christian high school and talking to a young administrator and a young teacher, and then basically saying, hey, thank you for coming in and talking about the Bible's justice imperative. The elders here, the older folks here don't ever want to talk about this. They try to ignore it. And so we're trying to be kind of subversive and change the culture. And I talk about how initially I was all for it. I'm like, that needs to happen because it's so important that we change some of the negative things that are going on in a lot of these Christian institutions that haven't changed since they missed the civil rights movement. But in having that conversation, what I ended up noticing was that the way they were going about the change was wrong. The way that they were going about it was in a purely secular, progressive way. So they were really kind of infatuated with all these secular theories, whether it be intersectionality and inclusion. And while those are things I think Christians should be able to wrestle with, we don't have to run from any, man-made concept. And there may be some value we can draw from it. They weren't looking at these things with a critical eye. And so what I felt was it was bringing them into unbiblical territory because they were trying to do something good, but their solution hadn't gone through biblical scrutiny. And so the statement that I was making was, as Christians try to address some of these issues, we have to make sure that we're not doing it in a way where we're kind of in awe of secular society, where we're taking these secular concepts and just applying them without any more examination. And I think too often when we enter academia, when we enter our different professions, there's kind of an insecurity there. And so we're looking for the approval of our professor, or we're looking for the approval of our peer group in our profession, and not really realizing that a lot of these folks kind of look down on Orthodox Christianity. And so once we see that, it's like, well, I need to kind of change who I am. I need to assimilate to let them know that I'm on their intellectual level. And so there's also some elitism that comes into that conversation, us wanting to be seen as elite, as in that class, as fitting that profile. And what I say is, look, we need to understand that we should listen to subject matter experts. We don't need to be anti-intellectual. Listen to subject matter experts, but be able to take the substance and leave the propaganda. Be able to take the ethics that's important for your profession and leave the stuff that's just somebody's opinion that is really secular, progressive, and not biblical. This is really a problem. And I know the parents out there may know this in K through 12 education with some of these, even Christian administrators and teachers who are just taking this stuff that they read from these journals that they get from these, teachers conferences and applying it because they want to be seen as cutting edge. But a lot of this stuff is not biblical. A lot of this stuff is not proven. These kids need to learn how to read. They need to, there's suicide rates that are super high. And we're jumping to this kind of novel, unproven stuff just to prove that we're kind of part of the smart group. And I think it really runs us into trouble. And the conclusion I make in the article is that we need Christians who are confident enough to be Christian in that space, to wrestle with secular secular theories and affirm what should be affirmed. We don't have to run from that. Some of the, we know common grace means that other people can be right about stuff too, but also reject what isn't true. And I just don't think a lot of folks in the cosmopolitan space and the professional space are going through that process in a way that's responsible and faithful.
And you've spoken to the AND campaign's approach and exactly what we're trying to do here as well. Reject the false choice. There just absolutely has to be a way to say, I care about things like racial unity and justice. I care about life, and I'm going to do that in a biblical way. And essentially what we're being pushed and what we're being told on social media and other channels is, no, you can have one or the other. And so I love this approach, just to say, I'm going to have the confidence in the scripture, and I'm going to take it into public life and apply it there. So if we could just get a large dose of that, that would be great. That'd be great.
Amen.
Yeah. So as we can wrap up, I talk often about the year 2050 because there's a large segment of kind of Christian citizens that will look back with a sort of nostalgia towards maybe a kind of a faux golden age. But if we're looking forward, I mean, this is the time that we're given. America's always had its problems. There's always been good things as well. But as we look towards the future, what do you see for the American experiment? And how can Christian citizens do everything they can? Of course, we can't control the future. We don't know what God's going to do. But how can we be faithful in our moment and do everything that we can to push the United States towards flourishing, to have exercise citizenship in a way that's going to point to Jesus?
I think there's two things that have to happen before we even get to that kind of change.
Okay.
Number one, we have to come together. I mean, we can't, how does the church tell the world, the nation to unify, and we're not unified? How can we have the same Great Commission, the same Great Commandment, and not come together and then expect folks without that to come together? It just doesn't make sense. And so we have to put our pride down, do some self-examination, and come together and advocate together, and also share resources. And if we do that, we'll become a model for others. And then I think the other thing is to love people first. You can be right about a whole lot of things and still not be faithful. We have to show compassion to folks that we may even disagree with, but we have to love them. And I think if we put that first, and not giving up the convictions, but if we put those things first, we'll be a model to where we will have more credibility in the public square that I think is really missing right now.
That's certainly a vision I'm praying for, working for. And I think God's going to have to move in a lot of hearts, but I have the confidence that the gospel has that type of power. And so looking forward to what God's going to do. So any recent kind of meaningful moments in your ministry where you've sensed God working through you, making a difference?
I mean, there's been a lot. I mean, God has been faithful. He's given this organization a clear vision. And I think just, even when we go to Christian colleges and universities and we see a young person who once thought that there wasn't a biblical model for doing justice, that there wasn't a biblical model for loving your LGBTQ neighbor without affirming. And they finally see that framework is already in the gospel, and we've kind of shown them where that's at. That's a really rewarding moment, because it's showing folks that you can love, you can be compassionate, and you can also remain faithful, that it's not that this false dichotomy that the world presents us with isn't reality.
That's encouraging. Well, final question. If you had a billboard on which you could put a message to the broader church, I might guess what it could be, but do you have a thought that you'd like to share with fellow Christians?
Yeah, I would say, and it's probably in that same vein of what you're thinking, I would say the gospel is about social justice and moral order, or the gospel tells us about social justice and moral order, not one or the other.
Well, Justin, I appreciate the time that you've taken with us, and given me a lot to think about, and hope that the listeners will take the time. And for those that may lean further right and think, well, we're even talking about these issues, I think that's part of the problem. If as Christians we can't have this type of conversation about what's going on in our society, I think that is evidence that we've allowed politics to bleed over and affect our religion rather than vice versa. So, Justin, where can listeners follow you? We'll certainly link the book as well as the Christianity Today article in the show notes. But what are some other ways that listeners could follow your work?
Yeah, so you can go to the Church Politics Podcast. That's the podcast I do with Reverend Christopher Butler, and we talk about politics, political issues from a biblical point of view. That's one place to check us out. You can always go to our Instagram, which is @AndCampaign, @AND That's the handle, to get just a lot of our content. And so our content's always coming out on our social media. A lot of people are loving the Church Politics Podcast because they just can't get that type of biblically based commentary in a whole lot of other places. And so those are definitely two good places to check us out.
All right. We'll certainly link those, the social media accounts and the book article in the show notes. So, Justin, thanks again for being on the podcast. We'll continue to pray for you and your work. Appreciate all that you're doing for the church in this space.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks for having me.